I call the Honourable David Parker.
Mr. Speaker, this is an argument about good economic management and fundamental economic principles of economic management. I know that there are parties in this House that don't think that climate change is a problem, that don't think we should therefore be in the Kyoto Protocol and don't price emissions. That is not the argument that we're having today. It's how an emissions trading scheme should be designed. I won't respond to the Honourable Nick Smith's accusations about process. Suffice it to say that the paper trail in respect of process is on the web. If people go to the Red Alert website, they can look at it, and the comments that Dr. Smith made are not correct. There were 4 outstanding issues of significance as between the Labor Party and National, and we had offered to compromise on all of them, but not go the whole extent on the 4th. The first one was the date for entry of sectors. Now, because the government's delayed so long, in practice you can't bring stationary energy on the 1st of January next year, and so that we agreed. I disagree. So we agreed to advance that. Oh, please, you've had your turn. So we agreed to extend that to the middle of June, and we also agreed to the government bringing that forward to transport forward to that same date. Noting, I would say, that it brings forward the date of cost for transport, contrary to some of the claims made by National. We actually don't understand the reasoning behind delaying agriculture further. Already New Zealand faces a cost for increasing greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture. We have to count them under the Kyoto Protocol, so why aren't they seeing an economic signal that reflects that reality? Nonetheless, we said, well, look, even on that, if that's politically important to the government, you won the election, we'll compromise on that too. So there wasn't a problem there. In respect of price caps, well, if you're going to trust markets, you actually shouldn't have price caps. If you're going to trust markets and you want the ETS to work, you shouldn't have price caps. But again, we said, look, the longer the price cap and the lower the price cap, the more is the problem. If it's not too long and it's not too low, we could probably go there too. Don't think it's the best outcome, but we could compromise on that. Not convinced that the so-called halving of electricity cost works, because of course we don't change the long-run price of electricity, which is driven by the marginal cost of new supply, which is unaffected by the discount that you're giving to electricity wholesalers. But nonetheless, we said we can live with that. We were then left with the biggest issue, which was free allocation. And this is where the analysis has been so poor by the government, because the government has not yet justified their transitional measures. They're saying that we're trying to have a transition that moves to full pricing of emissions over time. And yet during that period, they're going to let people increase the amount of free emissions.
What did NZIER say?
NZIER had a report which was flawed in a number of areas. For a start, as it said in its own report, it didn't have properly factored into its report the effect of increasing dairy land prices and other marginal land prices on forestry. And then it said, in the end, it's a line call on the basis of their analysis. And we asked Treasury officials about this. We said, look, do you rely upon a general equilibrium model that produces a line call to overturn settled economic theory? And of course the answer is you don't. You don't. The reality here is that New Zealand faces a cost for increases in emissions. During a period when other countries aren't pricing emission, there is a very real risk that industries that are exposed to competition from countries that aren't pricing emissions will not be able to compete, and therefore, during that transitional period, New Zealand would lose businesses that long-term should be sustained here. And that's why there should be generous free allocation to major emitting industries facing competition like that. But that doesn't mean that it is in New Zealand's economic interest to let that cost grow. It does not follow that you should do that. There are some similarities between this and reduction of tariff policy. Now, there are arguments that are still had to this day in New Zealand when Sir Roger Douglas and others deregulated the New Zealand economy and exposed the New Zealand economy to competition and countries that And so we didn't have, so we phased out tariffs. Now, actually, I agree with that move. I agree with that move, that we should have phased out tariffs. There is a question as to whether we should have done it a wee bit slower, and I actually think that's a fair question, but we clearly should have done it. But no one thinks that during, whether it should have been slightly slower or was the space that we did it, that we should have increased protection during the phase-out. And that's what this bill does. It increases the protection of the agricultural sector to allow them to increase their emissions above their current levels of emissions, and taxpayers have to pay for it. And that leads to the misallocation of economic resources. And it is, Dr. Smith, if that was not true, you would be able to agree to a cap on the free allocation in the agricultural sector. You have said, and I accept that at least in the short term, that the cap on allocation in the industrial sector would have been able to be agreed by your government because your new allocation methodology in industry would not breach that cap anyway. And I accept your word, assuming that, and we'll go through the numbers on that. But in respect of agriculture, we know that the government and the industry already say they're at world's best practice, therefore they won't have to do anything more than increase their output to get more free allocation. And that makes New Zealand poorer, not more wealthy. It sends the wrong economic signal. We don't have a change in land use away from high emissions behaviour towards low emission behaviour on land use, and this is 1/2 of our emissions. 1/2 of our emissions. This is economic mismanagement by the current government. And this is the national government that previously visited supplementary minimum prices on New Zealand. That was poor policy from a prior national government, and it actually took a Labour government with help of with Sir Roger Douglas and David Long and others to actually remove what were improper supplementary minimum prices. And this is actually a smaller, it's not nearly as significant as SMMPs, but it is a subsidy for increased emissions in the electricity sector. It is exactly the same in principle. There is no difference. And that's why we can't agree that you should have uncapped free allocation in agriculture. I want to move to a couple of other issues. No, we can't. We shouldn't have uncapped free allocation for industry either. The reality, as the Minister says, is so long as the rate of allocation under an intensity basis in industry is reasonably strict, you actually don't breach the cap. So it becomes a semantic argument, but it isn't a semantic argument in agriculture. And as a consequence, we're not going to see the hectares of land that we need planted out in trees to absorb carbon, because that's a low-cost way of reducing our emissions. And we're not going to see the reductions in agriculture that we should see by encouraging them towards low emissions behaviour. And quite apart from the environmental outcome, we're actually going to get poorer as a country as a consequence of this change to the allocation methodology rather than richer. And that is bad policy. It is not about jobs, as the Minister says. We all agree that there should be generous free allocations so that we don't cause enterprises to leave. But the means of production in agriculture are fixed. It is land, it is processing equipment, and it is livestock. No one's going to pick them up and take them away. The question is whether you want that sector expanding in a way that doesn't internalise the cost of their emissions. Now, they will still expand in areas where it is profitable to do so if they are facing the marginal cost of emissions. But they won't expand where it isn't profitable to expand, including the marginal cost of emissions. And that's what an emissions trading scheme is meant to do. And if this current scheme that the government seems determined to push through does that, it actually makes New Zealand poorer, not richer. Quite apart from the environmental consequences, we get poorer, not richer. I'm not being pure. I'm saying we can have intensity-based allocation. What I'm just saying is during the transitional phase, as you want emissions coming down, you shouldn't pay for them going up beyond a cap. You can allocate on an intensity basis up to that cap. It's not as good as on a historical base in terms of the marginal price signal it sends to the emitter, but you can do it. Lastly, there's another very important point of principle that this government is breaching. Treaty settlements are full and final. Treaty assets become assets that are subject to the laws of this land. The National Government deal with the Maori Party says that that is no longer the case, that they are going to do a special deal for Ngāi Tahu in respect of assets that they received The government of the day did nothing wrong. They didn't misrepresent the position, but Dr. Nick Smith says it's not true, and yet there's a specific line that says that they're going to address the issues on value of pre-1990 forests that went to Maori under treaty settlements. It is absolutely true.
I'm sorry to interrupt the member. His time has expired. I've called Jeanette.